Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. I feel like we've been having so many intros here that introduce our friends of the show. It's almost like we've been having this run of reunions, and then we sprinkle in a new guest here and there. But this one is one of those ones that anytime this person has something that they've investigated, something that they've written, they're more than welcome to come back on the show. His latest book is phenomenal, and he's written so many books, so to say that is quite a statement. I'm not being hyperbolic, but Tim, without any exaggeration, I would love to know how you're doing.
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for asking. And yes, very excited to welcome back one of our favorite guests to these airwaves. It's Casey Sherman. He is a New York Times best-selling author, and he wrote a new book called Blood in the Water, The Untold Story of a Family Tragedy. And this is about Nathan Carman, a young man who is mixed up in the deaths of his grandfather and mother. Actually, I should say the murder of his grandfather and the death of his mother. And this new book that Casey wrote is all about this sort of twisty story about Nathan and his past, and it's very timely.
And you're right, this is a tragic story because it involves this family that was dysfunctional, and you have this character in Nathan Carman who is on the autism spectrum. The media painted him almost like this Tom Hanks character who survived this ordeal, was rescued at sea, and then once the details started coming out, they really did not waste any time in condemning him, dismantling his story. What Casey does in this book, Blood in the Water, in his own words, he says he just threw a fastball right down the middle, gave you all the details for the defense, for the prosecution, and in his Casey Sherman fashion, weaves together this story that is a page-turner and almost unable to put down. So if you think that you know the story of Nathan Carman, just based on what you've seen in the media, you for sure need to pick up this book and get the real story.
Okay, so check out Casey Sherman's new book, Blood in the Water, wherever you get your books. All
right, we're going to break real quick for commercial, and we'll be right back with Casey Sherman and the story of Nathan Carman, Linda Carman, and Blood in the Water. And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Welcome back to the podcast, Casey Sherman. Casey, how are you today?
Tim and Lance, it's good to be back. How you doing?
Doing really well. It's great to have you back. I just feel like we learn so much every time you come on the show. We learn so much about how you write, how you investigate, and how you tell the story of these individuals and these crimes that have been committed in such a way where it's absolutely riveting, but I don't want to get too deep in that. There are a few people who don't know who you are, so could you just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. Let's see. Casey Sherman, longtime investigative journalist, New York Times bestselling author. I've written 18 books. This is my 18th, Blood in the Water. A few of my books have been adapted into major motion pictures, and I love what I do. How's that?
Very good.
That's perfect.
Yes, and your new book, Blood on the Water, Blood in the Water, was released April 8th. So congratulations on the new book. It is excellent.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about the story? Where does it take place?
Where doesn't it take place? I guess we should, start there. This is a story that first got on my radar in 2016 when a young man on the autism spectrum named Nathan Carman took his mother, Linda, on a deep-sea fishing trip off the coast of Rhode Island in late September. The aluminum boat that they were fishing on goes down. She disappears, and he ends up on a life raft for up to, according to him, 8 days before he is miraculously rescued by the crew of a passing Chinese cargo ship. And I remember when it happened, it made national, international headlines, and they had no photographs of Nathan's rescue at sea at that time. So the news media was showing images of Tom Hanks in the movie Castaway. And that's how they really treated the story, this bittersweet story about a young man's survival, and unfortunately, there's no sign of his mother. But when they bring Nathan back to the Coast Guard station in Boston, they begin to dig into a story. And to them, the story does not add up. And ultimately, they start to believe that well, Nathan looks like he killed his mother at sea. And then they also understand and learn that he's also the prime suspect in his grandfather's murder in his grandfather's home back in 2013 with 3 rifle blasts to the head, all allegedly to get his hands on a $50 million family fortune.
Well done synopsizing that part of the story. Just a question on when you're writing this style of book that you're writing and your style of writing in particular, as you read this book, your adrenaline is going. I mean, as you're writing this book, are you feeling that same adrenaline as like things are closing in on certain characters?
Oh, sure. 100%. I mean, I try to write that propulsive thriller, even though it's, true crime and nonfiction, and I know where the story's going when I sit down to write it. I put a lot of action in my books, and this story certainly lent to that. Every book that I write, I really want to grab that reader's attention in the first page. So instead of starting chronologically and getting to this incredible rescue at sea, I begin with that. And, that's my idea of or challenge to hook the reader right off the bat, and then take that reader through all the different narrative weaves and twists and turns along the way to see what this story ultimately became.
I remember it happening. I remember seeing it in the news, and I do remember the comparison with Tom Hanks. When did it come back on your radar where you started to consider that this would be something more for you as a project?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was considering it back in 2016, but it hadn't been, in my estimation, fleshed out enough. Every book that I write, I usually forecast my books, 5 years in advance. So I know what topics I'm going to be tackling each year. So this was always on my radar, but it was pretty far down the runway. And then in 2022, Nathan Carman, the person at the center of this story, is indicted for murder on the high seas because authorities had never been able to find the remains of his mother, but somehow they were able to build a case against him over time. And I thought, okay, this is a story that's worth telling for me. And, all the media reporting at the time, there was basically a straight line between the allegations of Nathan in both situations and his guilt in both alleged crimes. But I go into all my stories with a very unbiased view. And that's really where the research and the digging takes place. I have to gumshoe these cases, and I let the evidence take me where I need to lead. Over the course of, well over a year, it was tracking down every primary source document that I could, which was primarily a lot of the Coast Guard investigation into this case, and then going back to Nathan's grandfather, John Chakalos, digging through a lot of the investigative reports that I came across. And then coupled with that, interviewing well over 30 witnesses, both on the record and off the record, who told me explosive details about this case. And ultimately, to me, it's a story about a very dysfunctional, wealthy family where greed may or may not have led to double murder.
Speaking about the suspicion on Nathan, can you tell us some of the details on why there was suspicion when he was found at sea?
When they brought him back to the Coast Guard station and they interviewed him for the first time, he claimed that he was fishing with his mother in an area of the North Atlantic called Block Canyon. And they used the word canyon specifically because basically it's the Grand Canyon of the North Atlantic. The depths are well over 140 feet deep. You don't go out into that area 115 miles off of Martha's Vineyard unless you have a vessel that's prepared for it, where, a 40 to 60 foot fishing vessel with the proper equipment and the proper crew. Nathan had a 31-foot aluminum fishing boat, and he had 2 fishing rods, and he had his 54-year-old mother out there with him. But when they found him, he was drifting in his life raft in the opposite direction to where the currents would have taken him at the time. So they began to pick at his story a little bit and said that was almost impossible. And when he was miraculously rescued, not by the Coast Guard, by the way, the Coast Guard had been searching for him and his mother for 5 days. They searched an area of about 64,000 square miles using every apparatus that the Coast Guard had available to them at the time. And it was one of the biggest or costliest search and rescue operations in Coast Guard history. They couldn't find any trace of him. Nathan is found in the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic by the crew of a Chinese cargo ship. And they rescue him. And when they bring him on board, somebody who's been out in the elements on a life raft for that long, you start to see, the effects that the weather and the conditions take on the human body. That person becomes hypothermic. That person becomes malnourished. All of your muscular conditions, you start to lose it, being bounced around in the waves over a period of time. But when Nathan was rescued, he basically pulled himself on board the Chinese cargo ship with very little help. And he didn't look like he had been out in the elements for any period of time. So the question that the investigators had in that case was, well, where was he?
Okay, and much like the way your book is constructed, we've done about 8 minutes of this high intensity, oh my goodness, how's this going to go? But now I want to take it back a little bit, and I want to revisit his grandfather. What happened to him, how Nathan was treated by other members of his family in regards to that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Lance. Going back to the murder of Nathan's grandfather in 2013, the grandfather's name was John Chakalos. John Chakalos was a very wealthy real estate developer in New England. He had built assisted living facilities. His net worth was about $50 million at the time that he was killed inside his very modest home in a neighborhood in Connecticut. The killer was stood at the foot of his bed with what investigators believe was a Sig Sauer rifle, fired 3 shots. The first shot hit John's torso and traveled up his body. And then the other 2 shots were the kill shots that took out the back of John's head. Immediately after this very violent homicide, Nathan's aunts, Nathan had 3 aunts, and then along with his mother, Linda. And the aunts get together and they begin to weave a narrative for police. They said, we know who did it, and it's our nephew, Nathan Carman. Which, it came to a surprise, obviously, for Nathan. And for a lot of people that knew John Chakalos, the victim, because what motive did Nathan Carman have to murder his grandfather? Just to take you back a step here, John Chakalos loved his grandson, Nathan, didn't look at him as any different from anybody else, even though Nathan had Asperger's syndrome. We don't call it Asperger's anymore because Dr. Asperger turned out to be a Nazi. But John Chakalos, at 87 years old, was going to give the entire family business to Nathan, his first adult grandchild in a Greek family. And there were other people in the family that didn't want that. The more I learned about John Chakalos, here was a guy that was very Shakespearean, almost King Lear-esque, if you will. He had 4 daughters, and he pitted his daughters against each other for his love, his affection, and ultimately his money.
Now, why did Nathan's aunts immediately suspect him in his grandfather's murder?
It's a great question, a question that I still have not been able to get a thorough answer for. I don't know why they suspected him. Nathan was the last physical person to talk to John Chakalos and see him the night that he was murdered. But John, after Nathan left, had 3 phone calls. One was from Nathan's mother, Linda, who had a very volatile and oftentimes violent relationship with her father. Another call came in from John's 25-year-old mistress. Now, John Chakalos, the public persona of John Chakalos was that he was a pillar of his community, that he would give back to his community. John lived very opulently at a huge mansion in New Hampshire, but had a modest estate in Connecticut where he was killed. But the private John was a lot different. John had dark secrets. John, while his wife was on her deathbed with breast cancer, started a relationship with a 25-year-old woman, paid her to perform sex acts for him. They had headphone sex the night that John was murdered. John was known to leave money around the house. This young mistress certainly had a boyfriend at the time that was a drug dealer known to police who had a dark past himself. So, there were a lot of suspects that I reveal in this book other than Nathan Carman, or including Nathan Carman, I should say.
Right, and not to give away too much, but what type of investigation went into the murder of John Chakalos?
Not, to me, a very thorough investigation at all. I think the investigators at the Windsor Police Department in Connecticut, first of all, they really didn't have any experience in homicide cases. It's a pretty quiet town. This didn't happen in Hartford. This didn't even happen in Boston. This happened in a very small town where murder was an anomaly. And I think that the investigators had tunnel vision and went after Nathan right away based on what his aunts had told them. They interrogated Nathan and they interviewed him, and Nathan didn't answer their questions to their liking. because Nathan was on the autism spectrum and, did not interact with people the way that Tim and you, Lance, and myself would. So instead of bringing in an expert on the autism spectrum to be a part of these question and answer sessions, they didn't do that. They treated Nathan like a suspect. And one of the things that they were really focused on, and this is a legitimate concern, was that Nathan owned a rifle that they believed was similar to the rifle used to murder John Chakalos. And Nathan could not tell authorities what happened to that rifle. In fact, that rifle has never been recovered.
And how old was Nathan at this point?
About 19 or 20 years old, very young. And, going into that family dynamic, I realized that, John Chakalos, the grandfather, and Linda Carman, the mother, they had a tug of war over Nathan's care for his whole life. John wanted, as I said, to, present Nathan the family business, all $50 million worth, while his mother wanted to keep him in bubble wrap. Didn't feel like he should be mainstreamed, didn't feel like he should be, interacting with others. And there's one moment in the book where that comes to a head after Linda Carman puts Nathan into psychiatric treatment in Hartford. And she's hoping that Nathan gets the care that she thought he needed at the time. And he was a teenager. He was a high school senior at the time, or a junior. And the grandfather who was paying for that care showed up every day with a copy of the Wall Street Journal and ate pizza with his grandson, talked business with his grandson. Nathan missed all of his, or a good majority of his therapy sessions. So they had an argument, Linda and John, and that argument turned violent and punches were thrown. It was a knives out situation, basically. And Linda Carman was arrested for elderly abuse. And when Linda Carman was getting the handcuffs put on her, she said, "My father's worth $400 million over evaluating his wealth, and I want my cut."
Yeah, talk a little bit about that family dynamic a little more, if you don't mind. I mean, there seems to be so much resentment that comes from money and comes from inheritance. Was that all of it? Was it just a stem from money?
I think it was a complicated relationship that John had with his daughters, first and foremost. As I said, I think he pitted them against each other. John, respected men, didn't really respect women. So when the aunts realized that Nathan, with no business degree, with no business acumen, is being groomed to take over the family business, certainly they must have been concerned, and associates of the family were certainly concerned about that as well. So it was dysfunctional to a degree. People compare this book, Blood in the Water, to the Murdaugh case in South Carolina. The Chakalos family makes the Murdaughs look like a bunch of amateurs. This is high net wealth and people willing to do potentially whatever they could, to keep that money.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more about Nathan. What was he like in his early life leading up to these crimes?
Yeah, Nathan never had any friends. He couldn't communicate well with others. He had a horse when he was a teenager that his grandfather had purchased for him, a horse that he called Cruz. And that was really Nathan's only bonding experience with really anybody else. He didn't have a great relationship with his mother. He loved his grandfather. He had kind of a distant relationship with his own father, but he fell in love with this animal because the animal wouldn't judge Nathan. But the animal was sick, and the animal ended up dying. Nathan just kind of lost it after that. So early on in the book, I reveal that Nathan ran away from home when he was in high school, and it triggered a statewide search for this young man on the autism spectrum. And fortunately, he was found, but Nathan was never really the same after that. Nathan certainly could be erratic to the point potentially being violent, even though there really wasn't any background in that. So Nathan, given his very difficult challenges with his disorder, had trouble building relationships with anybody.
It's a really tragic part when someone in his situation experiences such a loss like that. The horse, to me, feels like so much more important than, and I'm not diminishing the
Sure.
nature of pets, but if you have a cat or a dog, you don't get a horse every day for a pet.
That's right.
It seems very personal. Was he ever prepared, in your opinion or in your experience, was he ever prepared to deal with loss?
No, I don't know. I mean, I don't think he was ever prepared to deal with loss. I don't think that was something that he could wrap his head around, quite frankly. And clearly that manifested itself after his horse had passed, because Nathan had a mental break and decided to leave. They eventually found him in the South. And when police, found him and understood that there was a nationwide search for this young man, they found that he had pictures of his horse on him, and that he had hair from Cruz, his horse, in a plastic bag. That was the closest thing that he had to really anything that loved him and, whom he loved back, other than his grandfather, John.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
So his gun that he had, what did he use the gun for?
Nathan would go up to New Hampshire with his grandfather and they would hunt together. At least that's what he was going to use it for, or target practice. It's interesting that John Chakalos paid for Nathan's Sig Sauer rifle. And Nathan, according to the gun seller that gave him the weapon, knew his way around the gun, knew how to use it. That was really why, at least Nathan claimed that he purchased the weapon. One of the reasons potentially why he may have been deceiving with law enforcement about where that weapon was after John was killed is that because Nathan would take that gun across state lines from Connecticut, from, New Hampshire to Massachusetts to Connecticut. And that, violated federal gun laws, which would have, brought Nathan several years potentially in prison had he been charged with that.
Right. And did Linda trust Nathan?
Linda trusted Nathan, never thought that Nathan would do her harm. She did not think that Nathan was a great fisherman or a great boater, but that was the only way that she could really bond with a child. Nathan loved to fish, and the only way that she could get any FaceTime with Nathan was to go out on the water with him, whether it was a lake in Canada or a river or, the harbor off of New England. Certainly not deep sea fishing with Nathan. She was not prepared for that and didn't think he was either.
Right. And that's surprising because I wasn't picturing the boat to be as, it's a big boat, right? It's 33 feet.
33 feet. It's a big boat when you're cruising around the harbor in it. It's not a big boat when you're, literally on the high seas of the North Atlantic. That boat gets very, very small very quickly.
Yeah. So when you see it and then you imagine that, however many miles out into the ocean, yeah, it gets really small really fast, but it also wasn't like a really durable boat, right?
No, it wasn't a durable boat, certainly not seaworthy for that. And part of its durability was called into question because Nathan was making ill-advised repairs to the boat after he purchased it in 2015. Nathan drilled holes in the transom of the boat and pulled out what they call trim tabs, which stabilize a boat of that length. Nathan said he did it to make the boat go faster. Ultimately, that was what caused the boat to sink.
Did he ever say why they chose to go out on the ocean that day?
They had planned previously to do it. The fishing season in New England goes all the way through late September. So this was kind of a prime, time for them to go out. So, and it wasn't an anomaly for Linda. She was very excited about the opportunity. So she had no qualms about it, but she did say that, the trip was going to take about a day. And she always sent her fishing logs to her friends. I'm going to be, here at X time. And if I don't get back to the marina, call the Coast Guard. And she didn't do this because she thought Nathan was going to do her harm. She just didn't think Nathan was very experienced. She didn't even like fish. She used to bring peanut butter and jelly sandwiches out on to the boat with her and her son, but she wanted to spend time with him because it was the only time that they could spend together.
And what was Linda's life like?
Linda was erratic. Linda could never really hold a job. Certainly somebody that relied on the family wealth, on all the trusts that John had set up for his daughters. John would give her a monthly allowance, which Linda would blow, going to the casinos in Connecticut, going on lavish trips around the world, sometimes with Nathan. So Linda was not really responsible for a good majority of her life, and certainly had a very, as I said, volatile and sometimes even violent relationship with her father.
And what did Linda think about her sisters going to the police about their father's murder?
Linda did not like her sisters, and I think that happened previous to John Chakalos's murder. Linda told her friends that her sisters were toxic and didn't want anything to do with them. So there was a friction between the sisters and the sisterhood, at least where Linda was concerned, and I think that was all fueled and fostered by their father John, who, as I said, wanted them to compete for his love and attention.
The day that they go out on the fishing boat, Linda's making sure that people know that she's out there, right?
Yeah. She told her two best friends where she was going to be and when she was going to get back.
Nathan had done repairs, quote, repairs on his boat.
Yep.
Who was aware that he had done these repairs? Like, who else, I guess, was aware that he operated this boat and that they had a plan to go out?
Well, Nathan didn't share that information with too many people, but with regard, Lance, to how many people knew he was making these repairs, everybody at the marina where he had docked that boat knew that he was out there making these repairs right out there in the open. And Nathan was a guy that, because of his disorder, he would want to take things apart and try to put them back together. After his grandfather's murder in 2013, where he was identified as a person of interest, he left Connecticut because he was hounded by the press and hounded by people that thought he was a killer. And he moved up to Vernon, Vermont, and he bought an old farmhouse, historic farmhouse. That was beautiful when he bought it. But Nathan wanted to take the whole thing apart, build it back together, and then flip it and sell it for double its value. Nathan had no experience with carpentry, much like he had no experience with boat repair. But he watched YouTube videos. He thought he could do it. So, looking at images of that house, that after Nathan's ill timed repairs, it looks like a big, pile of Jenga blocks waiting to fall down. And I think, Nathan, when he got that boat and wanted to make it go faster, he thought, I'm going to drill these holes and I'm going to repair them with a certain epoxy that would seal the holes, and the epoxy didn't seal the holes. And people at the marina, described Nathan covered in this glue. When they saw him at the marina, it looked like a kid that blew a big bubble from his bubble gum, and it all ended up on his face. That's what Nathan looked like while he was trying to, quote unquote, repair the boat.
Now, is that kind of him being showy about making these repairs, or was that what happened to him after trying his best?
I think somebody would have to go back and look at his house, as I said. Some people have claimed, he was trying to immediately set up an alibi. I don't think that's accurate at all. I think those are people that are coming out of the woodwork now, trying to claim that, to foster their own position. I've got no dog in this fight. I only take the story where the evidence leads me. But if you were going to plot your mother's murder, any murder, especially on the high seas, you might want to take that boat into dry dock and make those repairs under the cover of darkness. But Nathan didn't. He did it in front of at least 15 to 30 witnesses, all of whom could have and did testify. Later in a civil trial. Kind of
unrelated to the crime question. Why was the boat called Chicken Pox?
It had nothing to do with Nathan, and I write about this in the boat. The person that sold Nathan the boat got this boat from his parents, and the parents had a boat called Goosebumps. So this was just kind of an homage, if you will, to that name. I thought, was this named after the Chickenpox nightclub on Nantucket where I used to go as a kid? But no, it was just a kind of a family joke, an in-joke with the family.
Okay, and you mentioned a civil trial.
It's an amazing part of the story because, after this tragedy at sea or this murder at sea, if Nathan's a killer, Nathan doesn't go and hide. Nathan instead files an $85,000 claim against his insurance company for the boat sinking. And is willing to go to court and to trial to defend his actions in that case. And at the same time, Nathan's aunts take him to trial in New Hampshire under what they call the Slayer rule, because they feared that Nathan would go after the big chunk of his inheritance, and they were trying to stop him from doing that. So if they could declare Nathan civilly responsible for John Chakalos' murder, he would not have gained access to any of that money. So Nathan is in a courtroom in New Hampshire, and then he's also in a courtroom in Rhode Island, oftentimes defending himself.
How's his behavior at that time?
Well, it's amazing. I studied the court hearing in New Hampshire because the court trial in Rhode Island, there are no cameras allowed in the courtroom. But the court hearing in New Hampshire, you can find it online. WMUR, the ABC affiliate, filmed it in real time. And Nathan, to his credit, does actually pretty well for somebody with no legal experience. Nathan was a quick study and, certainly battled these very well-heeled, high-priced attorneys from Boston and ended up winning that case.
Now, how did the press treat him? Did they treat him like he was the likely killer?
They treated him at first as a victim. They treated him afterwards as a killer. Maybe they didn't have the time to dig into this story as I did. And certainly, I understand what deadlines are, and they have to kind of feed the beast on the weekly, daily, and hourly news cycle. but I had the luxury of time. And I had the luxury of looking at this story from 30,000 feet and then drilling down to every avenue I could and asking the proper questions. Going to the Coast Guard investigators who are all convinced that Nathan murdered his mother at sea. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to go with you. Let's follow that theory as if you're correct, as if Nathan planned this murder and then murdered his mother at sea. Well, then how does he plan his getaway? Is Nathan studying the shipping lanes of the North Atlantic with the off chance hope that a massive cargo ship is not going to rescue him, but even find him out there 115 miles south of Martha's Vineyard? It, to me, is a hole in that particular part of the case. If you're going to plan a murder, you're certainly going to plan your getaway. And that, explanation never held water for me. And if Nathan wasn't in that life raft for 7 days, where was he? And that's a question that the Coast Guard investigators could not answer.
Can you tell us a little bit about Nathan's account during those 7 days?
Yeah, sure. Nathan's account. And again, this is Nathan talking that they were fishing in Block Canyon. And I think Nathan got the area wrong. Nathan was repeatedly always misnaming fishing spots in that general area. He didn't know where he was going. He claimed that boat literally fell out under his feet. And as Nathan was preparing safety apparatus, the lifeboat, he told his mother to bring in the fishing lines. And she did, and he never saw her again. Now, one of the anomalies there is that Nathan went into the pilot house 3 times while he was preparing for abandoning ship. And he could have called for help. He had an emergency beacon to do so. And he didn't do that. So that's certainly suspicious, correct? And I believe that as well. Interviewing people that are experts in autism spectrum disorder, they will say that Nathan had a task, which was to get the life raft ready. He focuses on that task first, then he goes back and focuses on something else, whether it's calling for help, whether it's reaching for his mother. There are people on the autism spectrum, people with Asperger's, are very routine oriented. They have to finish one task before they go to the next.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
Okay, so it's reasonable to not assume that was an intentional error.
I think there's certainly reasonable doubt there, which to me, had Nathan gone to trial, I think the prosecutors would have had a very difficult time convicting him, whether or not he was guilty. And then you go back to John Chakalos' murder in 2013. The one thing that, the law enforcement agencies seem to overlook or don't want to downplay is that John Chakalos was murdered at 2 a.m. in the morning. That's according to his next door neighbor, who heard a long, loud bang coming from John's bedroom. And it woke her up, startled her, and she looked at her digital alarm clock, and it read 2 a.m. And that's when her dog started barking. So a short time later, there's a screeching of tires on that street, which is very rare because it's a cul-de-sac, and it's very quiet. Well, at that same time, guys, Nathan is captured on surveillance camera at least 14 miles away at a Stop and Shop buying ice cream, because Nathan used to play online chess all night. So how can you be on surveillance camera buying ice cream and then being at the foot of your grandfather's bed, killing him allegedly for $50 million? Doesn't really add up.
Did he have any enemies? Anybody?
Did John Chakalos have enemies? John Chakalos
while we're talking about that.
Countless enemies, which is one of the things that, I kept on bringing up. There was a bookkeeper who was embezzling $400,000 from John. John, allegedly had a lot of shady business deals. There was the mistress who had a drug dealing boyfriend who knew John had stacks of cash lying around his home. To me, Nathan would have been the least likely to murder the only person that loved him.
Right. And how common is that type of shotgun?
The 6 hour, it's a very common, rifle, certainly. But I think that the investigators, there's certainly a question in terms of whether or not those ballistics came from a 6 hour. The ballistics experts said it could have come from a 6 hour. It was likely to have come from a 6 hour, but that would have been debated in Nathan's criminal trial for sure. That wasn't the only weapon that could have committed that crime. or been used to commit that crime.
Right. Now I'm just kind of all over the place. Was Linda a strong swimmer?
Linda was a strong swimmer, I would imagine, because she'd been out on boats, her entire life, but nobody's a strong swimmer when you're 115 miles south of Martha's Vineyard. She didn't last long. Nathan claimed that he never saw her again, that he was calling her name, for at least the first day. And once she never answered his, calls, he had to focus on his own survival. And again, these are Nathan's words, not mine.
Can you explain the life raft? Because at one point, he's like zipped up in it, and
yeah, I mean, this is a 4-person life raft where you zip yourself inside. A lot of fishing, major fishing boats use these types of life rafts because it's immersive. You can stay inside and survive for a short period of time or an extended period of time. And Nathan had planned for, the possibility that he might have to abandon ship at some point, which could have been premeditation if he was planning his mother's murder because he had enough food and he had enough water to last him for several days, for sure.
Did any of this go to trial?
That's the startling part of this whole story. When I took on the assignment to write the book, Nathan's criminal trial was pending, and this was 2023. And in June of 2023, Nathan was found dead in his jail cell in New Hampshire. Came as a shock for everybody, including his attorneys. Immediately, the narrative was Nathan committed suicide, and he left a suicide note in his jail cell. That's not the case at all. The note he left in his jail cell was a note to his attorneys to follow up on a lead in the case. The next day, Nathan was an incredibly active participant in his defense. That kept him going. I spent a lot of time with Nathan's father, Clark Carman, and he told me, it was Casey, if anybody was conditioned to survive jail for one day or, 50 years, it was Nathan. Nathan had no friends. Nathan liked routines. He could wake up every day, get his 3 square meals, and go to the prison library and read or study up on his case. The likelihood, again, that Nathan would just suddenly commit suicide, especially because he had a great defense. The defense was going to bring forth some other, people around the family that had shocking allegations, not geared toward Nathan, but geared toward other people.
Who were the folks that were on his defense team?
His defense lawyer, he had basically a 2-person defense team, Dan Sullivan and Marty Manella, 2 very well-heeled trial attorneys that were taking on this case basically pro bono, thought they had a very solid case and were eager to get in front of a jury. Because one of the things that I always found strange was, why was the state of Vermont indicting Nathan on murder on the high seas when the alleged crime with no body occurred either off the coast of Massachusetts or off the coast of Rhode Island? And then what about the murder of John Chakalos in Connecticut? The FBI and the Coast Guard investigators, they shopped this case. So they went to Connecticut, and there were so many anomalies or unanswered questions in terms of John Chakalos's murder that the district attorney or the U.S. attorney wouldn't touch it. They weren't going to bring charges against Nathan Carman, nor would anybody bring charges against Nathan Carman in Massachusetts or Rhode Island, because they must have thought the cases were weak. So they got the newly minted U.S. attorney in Vermont to take this case on because they claimed that Nathan had purchased a lot of his fishing equipment on his computer from his home in Vernon, Vermont. Therefore, they could, lay claim to jurisdiction.
And you mentioned Nathan's dad, Clark. What does he think about all this?
He lost his son. He's always maintained Nathan's innocence, and he thinks it's an incredible tragedy. So, I spent a lot of time talking to Clark Carman, but that's certainly what he thinks. One thing that is very interesting that I found out, and I reveal it in my book, is that after Nathan died, I actually attended Nathan's funeral in Connecticut, and it was very sad, whether or not you think Nathan was a killer or he was innocent, because the only people that showed up were his lawyers and their staffers. And I remember, his defense attorney gave them, the most bizarre eulogy I've ever heard, because it was the opening statement he was going to give at the criminal trial. So you're hearing, the words murder in a Catholic church, which I had never heard before. We didn't know at the time that Nathan's aunts did show up. And I don't know if they were there, to pay respects to their nephew or they were there to make sure he was dead. But Clark Carman got a call from one of the family members, an aunt, shortly thereafter, and said, the aunt said, we would like Nathan's remains. Clark Carman said, what? And why? Well, we want Nathan buried next to his grandfather. If you believe that, someone murdered your father, would you want that person lying next to him for all eternity? I wouldn't. And Clark Carman dismissed that request, but then he thought, wait a minute. Clark believed that Nathan didn't kill his grandfather. And Clark also believed that Nathan loved his grandfather and that John Chakalos loved Nathan. So why shouldn't they lie next to each other for all eternity? And that's where Nathan is today.
And Nathan took his life in 2023, and you started working on this story when?
I started working on this story in 2023, always observing the case from afar, going back to 2016, but really digging my claws in after he was indicted, which was 2022, I believe, and it's the most bizarre indictment I've ever read. It's murder on the high seas, and, they lay out the case against Nathan with regard to his mother's drowning and potential murder, but they also bring John Chakalos into the indictment. They don't charge Nathan with anything. But they want the public, potential jurors, to understand that Nathan's a double killer here. And I think that was a miscarriage of justice to do so.
One of the craziest parts of the story is that any sort of, opinion or influence was being put out there like that to the public before any sort of trial was on the books or
right.
of record. It's insane.
It's insane. Guys, I've covered in my career 200 homicides. I've never seen anything like it. Which made me lean in. And I was planning on covering the trial, recording all the witness testimony and hoping to get information on the side. It was almost going to be a layup assignment for me. And then Nathan tragically dies. So then I've got to really put my investigative journalism hat on and dig. And I did dig and found a story that was, to me, much different than what the public has been led to believe for now almost 20 years.
What went on in your head when you first read that, or when you first heard that Nathan had committed suicide, that Nathan had died?
Yeah, I was shocked and didn't really know if I was going to abandon the project and pivot to another story. But, the more I heard about it, I said, okay, well, let me still do my job and see if I can find a story here. And interviewing, again, 30 witnesses and getting access to Coast Guard investigative documents, because I'd written a book about the Coast Guard called The Finest Hours, which became a big Disney movie in 2016. I've got a great relationship with many of the investigators there. They trust me. They knew I was going to write the story the right way, but I was also going to ask questions and be as objective as I could in my reporting.
So is there some suspicion over Nathan's death?
I think there is. I think that his attorneys certainly don't believe Nathan took his own life. I've got my own theories there, but I haven't been able to support those, the questions I have, I should say, with physical evidence. So I didn't include it in the book. But I do think an investigation, I wished that Nathan's remains weren't cremated as quickly as they were, because I would have liked to have seen his body re-autopsied by outside professionals. Because we may have learned something different, but we can't do that now.
Such a wild story. And even now, do you feel like you're finished with it?
In this book, guys, I threw my fastball straight down the middle. I present you the prosecution's case. I present you the defense case. I wanted to be objective and not lean one way or the other. But I felt like Nathan needed a voice. Nathan needed his day in court. And I think that Blood in the Water serves as that. What
is your favorite book that you've ever written?
Again, guys, it's like asking, about your children. I always say it's the next one, and that sounds corny, but I get so excited about my next project. For the first time in my history as a writer, the day that Blood in the Water launched on April 8th, I finished my next book, which will come out next year, and it's going to be called The Devil and Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright, the world-renowned architect, the greatest architect that ever lived, was involved with a mass murder in 1914. which changed his whole trajectory as a professional architect. And the story that I found was Romeo and Juliet meets The Shining.
What?
Definitely want to hear more about that. Looking forward to that one.
Hold on. Romeo and Juliet. We're all familiar with the story of Romeo and Juliet. Most of us are familiar with the story of The Shining. I need something a little bit more there.
Tissue. It's there was a beautiful love affair that Frank Lloyd Wright was involved with, somebody outside his marriage, someone who left her family for the architect, and Frank Lloyd Wright left his family. Now that was frowned upon, obviously, in that time period, or the first sex scandal in American history, and covered ad nauseum by the yellow press at the time. Frank Lloyd Wright ultimately built her a monument to their love and hired a caretaker. That caretaker got an axe, and that caretaker killed everybody inside that home, including the woman and her children.
Oh my God!
Wow. Well, there's the
The
combination.
Shining part.
I'll be back a year from now, guys. We'll go over it in detail, and
can't wait.
I'll probably have my next book written by that time.
Wow. Good Lord.
Wow. Very cool. Well, is there some place specific that you like to tell listeners to get your books?
Sure. Definitely support your independent booksellers, but also go on Amazon. I like to see, number one bestseller every time I open that Amazon page. So keep, fans, please keep it up and support. And, I think they're going to find, what I do think, guys, is that this is going to be a great talker for book clubs all around the country, because I'm already seeing that in some of the online reviews. There are readers that are convinced that Nathan is guilty. And there are other readers that are convinced that he got railroaded by the system. And I like that, because, people ask me, what do you think, Casey Sherman? I say, depends on the day, right? Some days I'll wake up and think, this young man was a criminal mastermind. Then there are other days, and I think there's no way he could have possibly pulled it off, because I know how difficult it is to get away with one murder, to get away with two, one on land, one at sea, years apart. That might be giving Nathan a little bit more credit than he deserves in this case. But if he did it, chef's kiss, hats off to a diabolical killer.
Well, hats off to you for putting the story together in such an amazing way, and we will recommend it like we do with all your other books to the listeners. Links will be in the show notes and everything, but amazing work. Appreciate you.
I always appreciate the conversation, guys. I mean, this is really one of my favorite stops on book tours. So thanks for having me on again.
Awesome. More than welcome.
All right. Thanks, guys.